All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody who is here. My name is Maggie Tom. I am the director of the FAFSA program at Northern Arizona University. That stands for Family Access, Communication, Transition, and Support. And we're excited that you're joining us tonight for our first part in a two-part series, Stepping Stones to the FAFSA. Tonight we'll be going through part one. But first, I'd like to hand it over to Myrna to introduce herself.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Myrna Lord, and I'm the Director of Client Services in the Office of Scholarships and Financial Aid. So if you ever go out there and make an appointment with our office, you'd be speaking to a team member on the Client Services team. So that's our little area. We're here to help.
Awesome. Yes, thanks for joining us, Myrna. So we are going to have Myrna and then our university admissions will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, go ahead and put those in that question and answer feature. I also want to say you don't need to memorize any of the links that we'll go through this evening. We will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow that'll have some of those links and information. As well as information for where you can get your questions to the different financial offices. We are going to get started with a quick poll, just a couple of questions just to see who's here, kind of gauge your knowledge, what you know, what you're looking to know. So Taylor is going to launch those now. All right, so it looks like we have an assortment of people joining us tonight. Some people, some first generation families. We have some that have completed a bachelor's degree and some that have completed more than that. Awesome. Okay. Give that just another second. Just have a couple more people to answer. All right, great. We are going to go ahead and do a quick survey, and that should pop up in just a second. Okay, and this pre-survey is just to make sure that we are giving you the information that you're looking to understand today. Awesome. Well, thank you all for taking that quick pre-survey. We will go ahead and get started. All right, so part one of our Stepping Stones to FAFSA and today's topic. So we're going to be going over the cost of attendance and net price. So we'd like to give you all a pretty firm foundation about why you fill out the FAFSA. And obviously that starts with understanding the cost of college and how we get help with the cost of college. So then we'll go through the free application for federal student aid, also known as the FAFSA. And then at the very end, we'll go through what we're calling Let's Create an FSA ID. And that is going to be your very first step that you need to do prior to filling out the FAFSA. So jumping in to the basics of financial aid, which includes cost of attendance and net price. So what is a cost of attendance? So colleges and universities are required by federal law to have an annual budget that's known as the cost of attendance. And that cost of attendance must outline the average cost of attending for a full-time student for one academic year. And a full-time student is considered a student that takes 12 or more credit hours at most institutions. And an academic year is typically made up of a fall semester and a spring semester. So the cost of attendance then is for 2 semesters of school. So that fall semester and then that spring semester as well. And the reason that it's important to understand cost of attendance is because this is often what you're going to find on a university's website. Another term for it is called sticker price. So often when you go, you're Googling a university with your kiddo, or you're the student yourself and you're looking at cost of college, what you'll come upon is going to be that sticker price or the cost of attendance. And that cost of attendance can admittedly be a little bit shocking when you're looking through those websites. So it's very important. And the first thing I'll tell you is it's very important to remember that that cost of attendance is an estimate. And it's made up of 2 different types of costs. And that's what we're going to go over right now. So those direct costs on the left-hand side of that slide, those are going to be things that you pay directly to the institution. Those are things that are charged by the institution. And they consist of tuition, fees that go on top of tuition, as well as housing and food costs. Another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at cost of attendance, if you are looking in state, so if you're looking at any of the 3 Arizona state schools, so University of Arizona, Arizona State University, and Northern Arizona University, and you are a resident, you live in Arizona, you're going to be looking at the in-state cost of attendance. If you happen to be looking at college in another state, you're going to be looking at the out-of-state cost of attendance, and those are going to vary. So those direct costs we there have on the left, those are going to be things that you see on a bill from the college. So tuition is going to be the average cost for a student who is enrolled full-time. So when you're looking at a cost of attendance, know that that amount is typically the average cost for a student enrolled full-time. And again, that is for an undergraduate student about 12 units. You're also going to see fees. So these are charges that are assessed for other college services, which can include things like technology access, use of a recreation center, and sometimes there's other things like at NAU, we have something called a green fee, and that goes toward some sustainability things that we have at the university. So those fees are going to differ depending on the university that you're looking at. So check in with the university directly if you're interested in learning more about what fees are made up of. You're also going to see housing. So if you have a student that is interested in living on campus, when you look at the housing on a cost of attendance, that is going to be the average cost of if your student is living on campus. Some institutions will show off campus or living at home in the cost of attendance as well. That can include an estimate of that as well. And then those direct costs is also going to include food. So that includes the cost of a meal plan on campus if your student has one. And if your student is living off campus, it'll be an estimate of the cost of food prepared at home. One thing to note, sometimes housing and food are lumped together. They can be called living expenses. I know the University of Arizona does that, but that is what is included in those direct costs. So what else is the cost of attendance made up of? So when you're reviewing that cost of attendance on a website for a college, you'll see those direct costs, but you're also going to see indirect costs. And those are the costs on the right-hand side of this slide. And there are things that we know students need to take into consideration that are going to cost things while they're in college, but these are not paid directly to the college. So things are going to be books and supplies. Those we know students need to pass their classes. It's also going to include transportation costs. So these would include things like gas or a parking pass. And then it's also going to include personal and miscellaneous. So those are costs for things like laundry, personal hygiene items. Maybe if your student comes to NAU and they need to get a coat, it's cold here. that would be where those items go. And the ones on the right there, your family has a little bit more control over. So those indirect costs that you see on a cost of attendance are things that you can work on with your family specifically to figure out how much you might be utilizing for that. The other thing to keep in mind when you're looking at a cost of attendance, so the reason we call that the sticker price as well, the cost of attendance that you see on university websites shows the price before financial aid is applied. Therefore, what you first want to remember, again, those indirect costs your family has some control over, but also that all of the cost of attendance that you see is going to be prior to any financial aid being applied to a student's account. And that brings us to what is a more accurate reflection of what you might pay for college, which is called the net price. So the net price is a more accurate reflection. And what that is that cost of attendance that we just talked about. So that tuition, fees, housing, meal plan, also those indirect costs, right? We're going to look at books, personal and miscellaneous costs, as well as transportation. So that cost of attendance, so that full number, and then it's going to subtract the financial aid that your student might be eligible for. And what you're left with there is the net price. And that financial aid on a net price calculator is often made up of grants and scholarships. Some net price calculators for certain institutions will include loans, but a lot of them do not include loans. So every institution is also required to have a net price calculator available to you so you can come up with what financial aid might your student be getting at that specific institution. And I say might because it is an estimate. Until a school has received your FAFSA and been able to package you with financial aid, the numbers are just an estimate. But it's a much better estimate than just looking at that cost of attendance. So those net price calculators will ask you a bunch of questions, often questions that you are also going to be answering on your FAFSA in order to get a better and more accurate idea of what financial aid you might get at that institution. And I am going to show you all a net price calculator as well as cost of attendance. I'll show that for NAU specifically, and then I'll pull up one of the other state schools so you can see that as well. So when we're looking at cost of attendance, right? So tuition fees and cost of attendance, this is for NAU. This is for the 2024-2025 catalog year. So that's the current year that you're in. So if you have students right now that are in 12th grade, come spring, you're going to start looking at the 2025-2026 catalog year. So this is for our current year that we're in, and you'll see that you can toggle back and forth depending on what you're interested in. Most likely you're going to be looking at undergraduate, so that first bachelor's degree, and it's going to give you your tuition per year for the different campuses. And then you're going to go down here. So if a student wanted to attend the Flagstaff Mountain campus, you'll see our cost of attendance here. And this is for the different types of students. But if you're an Arizona resident, you're going to look at this column and you can see it broken down just like we talked about. So there's that tuition amount. And that is going to be in-state tuition, 12 credit hours. It'll show the fees. It'll also then show that total tuition. And then these other expenses. So we have books, supplies, course materials, college fees, food, housing, and then those other indirect costs that we talked about, including personal expenses, transportation, and those books and supplies. So then you'll see this total estimated cost for an Arizona resident. That's your cost of attendance. That's also your sticker price. So this is the amount with all of these things added up prior to any financial aid being applied. And again, keep in mind that these indirect costs, like your books, supplies, as well as your personal and transportation, families have a little bit of control over those things, right? Your student might not need $2,500 budgeted for transportation costs. They might not need $900 for books and supplies. So you can save a little bit of money in these. And again, most importantly, just remember this is all prior to any financial aid. So most cost of attendance will have a direct link to that net price calculator. And this is what is going to give us a more accurate reflection of what we might pay after financial aid is applied. So if we click on that, you're going to do start new estimate. If you have an estimate already, you can always go back. And again, this is going to pop up. It's an estimate. It's for informational purposes only, subject to change, not binding, and it doesn't represent a final determination, but it is a really great way for your family to start looking at costs and potential out-of-state cost, not out-of-state, out-of-pocket costs when it comes to college. So you'll put in your date of birth, citizenship status. This is for the student. You'll answer if you have any of these. This SAI from the FAFSA. So when you fill out your FAFSA this December and you get an SAI, you can come back in here and directly input what your SAI is from the FAFSA. But since the FAFSA isn't out yet, we're going to go, we don't know any of these things. So we'll keep going. What's your parents' marital status? What is your family size? And how many members in your household are enrolled in college? This is what will be enrolled in college, so include yourself in that number. Financial information, so we'll go ahead and put just an example. And if you ever have any questions about why they're asking or what you need to be putting in there, there's this really nifty thing over here that'll explain to you where you can find that information. What apply to your parents' finances. So if people have money in checkings and savings, if they own property for investment purposes, that doesn't include the primary home, or if parents own a business or farm. And then your finances as the student. I do not work. And where are you in the enrollment process? So this is where is the student in the enrollment process to college. So let's say we're just researching right now. And then you'll do a little overview, make sure that's correct. And then this is going to be the net price. So that is cost after financial aid has been applied. And this is a breakdown of that. So it'll say what our tuition and fees would be, what housing and food would be, and then those indirect costs, see how that's broken down like we talked about earlier, books and supplies, transportation, and personal expenses. So again, these you have a little bit more control over. These are the things that are charged by the institution. And then down here is where it shows what you might be eligible for in financial aid. So it has need-based aid, so federal Pell Grant, some state grants and institutional grants, merit aid. So the total of this is $15,000. So it's going to take 33 minus the 15, and this is what is left over. And then you can also toggle between if you prefer to look at it by term. So you might have this out of pocket after your grants and scholarships have been applied. Keep in mind that federal loans are always an option. They're just not included in this net price calculator. And the other thing that I would like to show you is, so this merit aid, so you can put in here what the student's GPA is on that 4.0 scale to see how that might change the merit aid over here. So if you look at the merit aid, now we're at 5,844, put a 4.0 in. You can play with the GPA there. You can also play with things like if you're going to be at main campus, housing and food, if they're going to live on campus, off campus, or at So a net price calculator is just a really great way to start looking at college costs even before you fill out that FAFSA. And the other state institutions also have these as well. So if you're looking at the University of Arizona, you could look into incoming cost. So this is how their cost of attendance is laid out. So tuition and fees, living expenses. So you can start looking at different institutions. You can also then always just do this by Google because I assume everybody Googles the net price calculator as well. So you can do get my estimate, and then you can go through the same at the University of Arizona. And again, every institution is going to have a net price calculator as they're required to do that. Okay, awesome. So we're going to keep going through. So the next step, obviously, we understand the cost of attendance. We know that we should probably be looking at that net price to see what financial aid we might be getting at an institution. And that can help us budget. It can help us see maybe what kind of merit aid we might be getting for a certain GPA. So how do we go about getting that financial aid, right? Well, the first step to doing that is going to be filling out the free application for federal student aid, also known as the FAFSA. And I say this every time I talk about the FAFSA, the most important part of this entire title of the FAFSA is the free portion. If you ever get on a website where it's saying that you have to pay to fill out the financial aid application, exit straight away. The whole point is that it's free. So free application for federal student aid. So what is the free application for federal student aid and why are we completing it? So the FAFSA is a federal government form used to determine a student's eligibility for financial aid. It's the primary gateway to receiving federal student aid, which includes grants, work-study programs, as well as loans. Often institutions will require that the FAFSA is filled out if a student wants to receive certain institutional merit aid as well. So make sure that you are looking at that as well. Even if you don't want to take loans, check with the institution that you are applying to because you might be required to have a FAFSA on file in order to get scholarships as well. So why do we complete the FAFSA? So it's super important to complete, also super important to complete it early. So if you complete it early, you're going to be maximizing your financial aid. So the earlier that you submit your FAFSA, the more likely you are to receive the maximum amount of financial aid that's available to you. Why is that? Many colleges and universities award certain scholarships and grants on a first come, first served basis. So the earlier that you can get things done, the more likely you are to maximize those things. It also helps you to plan ahead. So completing the FAFSA early allows you to better understand what options you have in financial aid and start planning for those college expenses. It can help you make informed decisions about your education as well as avoid unexpected costs. It's a great way to figure out where you want to go to school. So if you're applying to both, let's say 2 different schools and you fill out that FAFSA and have it sent to both of those schools, what you'll receive back from each school is going to be a financial aid offer letter. And then you can compare those to see maybe which school is giving you more financial aid. What would be a better financial fit for you and your family? The third reason that it's important to complete it early is eligibility for state and institutional aid. So in addition to federal aid, many states and colleges will offer their own financial aid programs, and completing the FAFSA is often a prerequisite for eligibility to those programs. So you don't want to miss out on institutional aid or state aid, which again often comes at a first come, first serve basis. The other thing that is great to note is that the FAFSA is available both in English and Spanish. So if you would prefer it in Spanish, you can fill out and do the whole process in Spanish. So what does the FAFSA do? Why do we fill it out? So we talked about cost of attendance earlier. What the FAFSA does is comes up with how much financial need each family that fills the FAFSA out has. So it helps determine how much aid can a student receive, and how is that determined using the FAFSA. So what the FAFSA does is it comes up with this SAI, that middle thing right there. It's called the Student Aid Index. That's determined by completing the FAFSA. So all the information that goes into the FAFSA from both the family, the contributor, as well as the student, pushes out this number, that SAI. What institutions then do, colleges and universities, is they take that cost of attendance that we talked about earlier, they subtract the student's SAI, that student aid index, and the number that they're left with is the financial need of the student. And what institutions do is they fill up that financial aid, that financial need, with financial aid. So including grants, scholarships, loans, and federal work study. So that's how institutions determine how much financial aid a student can get at their institution. So the SAI, just to recap, the Student Aid Index is an eligibility number that's calculated by the FAFSA utilizing tax and other financial information. That number is then used to help determine by the school how much financial aid a student is eligible for. The Student Aid Index can be negative. It's not a dollar amount of aid eligibility or what your family is expected to provide. So a lot of times we'll hear families say, well, is this what I need to come up with? No, it's just what we utilize as institutions to determine financial aid. And you're going to see that number, what SAI your family has, on your FAFSA submission summary after your FAFSA has been completed. Okay, so we're just going to go through some FAFSA basics. Who needs to complete the FAFSA? When do you need to complete it? And what information do you need to complete it? So those three questions are what we're going to go through now. So who needs to complete the FAFSA? So any student who wants to be considered for federal, state, and school financial aid programs should be filling out the FAFSA. We recommend that everyone fills out the FAFSA. It's a great way, again, to shop around to figure out what school might be the best fit for you, what different aid options you might have depending on where you go to school. And then the other person that is going to need to complete the FAFSA is going to be the contributor. And the contributor refers to anyone who is required to provide their financial information on the FAFSA. And in order to figure out who is the contributor, I am going to pull up a website really quick. And again, we will send these out. So in order to figure out who is the contributor, there is this great little flow chart that the Federal Student Aid has filled. Oh my gosh, that is way too close. So it's going to take you through a flow chart. Are your biological or adopted parents married to each other? If they are, it'll tell you what you need to do. If they are not, do your biological or adopted parents live together? If they do, it'll tell you what you need to do. If they do not, then did one parent provide more financial support? So you'll go through like that. There is also a really great, and again, we'll send these links out. This is a really important first step, is just figuring out who needs to complete the FAFSA, who's considered a contributor on the FAFSA. And Federal Student Aid came up with this really great, it's called like a parent wizard. And what you do is fill this out and continue through it, and it will tell you, it's a tool that'll tell you who needs to participate in the student's FAFSA form. So this is a really great first step, well in advance of the FAFSA coming out, to figure out who is the contributor. That way in December, when you sit down to work on the FAFSA, you're not trying to figure out who should be completing it of the parents at that time. Okay. Make sure I went through all of that. Great. So then the next step is going to be, when do we apply for financial aid? And like we talked about in a couple of slides previous, as soon as possible, as soon as the FAFSA comes out, I recommend filling it out again, because some of that aid is on a first come, first serve basis. So the FAFSA this year is going to open in December. And that's why we started these webinars early. We have a step 1 and a step 2. And that's going to be for academic year 25-26. And it's going to use tax year information from 2023. So if you are a current 12th grader, if your student is a current 12th grader, they are going to be a first year student next fall 25. So that is what is there, that academic year 25-26, and then using tax year information from 2023. You apply for the FAFSA every single year. So this year you'll fill it out in December, and next year when it comes out, you're going to fill it out again. And every single year that your student is in college, you'll need to apply for financial aid. Okay, so what do I need to fill out the FAFSA? So the very first step, so we figured out who our contributor is. We know we want to be ready to fill out the FAFSA as soon as it comes out in December. What do we need to fill that out? The very first thing is going to be your FSA ID, which you're going to create at studentaid.gov. The student needs their own FSA ID, and whoever the contributor is, so remember we went and found out who our contributor was, who needs to help us fill out that FAFSA, is also going to need their own FSA ID as well. And we're going to go through what the process is for getting that FSA ID. The other stuff that you're going to need to fill out the FAFSA is going to be the contributor information, as well as the student's information, so things like social security numbers. We're also going to need dates of birth, things like that. And then your 2023 federal income tax return. It's important to note that beginning with the FAFSA this last year, the contributor and the student are required to provide consent and approval to have their tax information transferred directly from the IRS to the FAFSA form. The consent is mandatory, even if the contributor or student doesn't have a social security number, didn't file a tax return, or filed a tax return outside of the United States. So while you're filling out your FAFSA, you will consent to that, but we always recommend that you should have your 2023 income tax return in front of you as well, in case you do have to manually input anything. You'll also need records of untaxed income, any records of assets, and then a list of schools that the student is interested in attending. Okay, so our FSA ID, contributor information, tax return. So these are all the items that you should have done and collected prior to sitting down to filling out that FAFSA. So the first step in that is filling out and getting an FSA ID. That's step 1 to filling out the FAFSA. So what is an FSA ID? An FSA ID is the username and password that you'll use to access the Federal Student Aid website to fill out your FAFSA. It is required to complete the FAFSA and any other federal student aid form. So this is considered like your signature. Like I said, you have to have a separate one. The student has their own. The contributor has their own. And how you do that is you visit studentaid.gov and then you click create an account. And I will show you how simple that is. So we'll go to studentaid.gov. So you're going to go to this website. You're going to create an account. And then you're going to create Get Started. So it'll tell you here, what can you do with your account? You can fill out the FAFSA. You can complete other online forms. So once a student is in school, they might have other forms that they need to go to the FSA website to fill out. And they can also review the student aid they've received. They'll click Get Started. And again, you'll do this process for both the student as well as the contributor. And you'll go through and fill out all of the information. There's this nifty little Aiden virtual assistant. So if you do have questions, FSA, this website also does have some really good toggles. So if you have questions, let's say social security number, and it says, what if I don't have a social security number? You'll just go ahead and answer these questions. So you can still have an FSA ID without a social security number as well. You'll go through this process. And one of the reasons it's super important, again, to get this process started now is because it can take a couple of days, 3 to 5 days to verify an account. So if you sat down to work on your FAFSA in December, but you didn't do an FSA ID yet, it might take you another week to be able to fill out the FAFSA because there's some verification involved. Okay, so what you'll need to create that FSA ID, social security number if applicable. And again, you can create an FSA ID without a social security number. And then your own email address. And that is placed in bold because the student and the contributor cannot use the same email address. You will need separate email addresses. So if your student doesn't have an email address yet, or if a parent doesn't have an email address, I would also recommend creating that sooner rather than later so you can get the FSA ID process started. So a couple of tips and reminders. Student and contributor each need their own FSA ID. So I recommend going through and figuring out who's going to be the contributor on the FAFSA and then going in to create that FSA ID. The email addresses used to create your FSA ID cannot be the same. It is also not recommended that you use one that is school issued. So if a student has one from a school, whether that's a university that they are already in, we recommend using a personal email. And that's because you're going to be using that same FSA ID forever. So it's important that you can always get to the email address associated with your FSA ID. Don't share your account information with anyone. Make sure you keep your username and password in a safe place. And again, that's because you're going to use it every single year, and you're only going to use it like that once a year, most of you. So really important that you keep that somewhere that you know you can get it. Also, once you create your account, again, it can take 3 to 5 days for your FSA ID to be verified. So plan to do your FSA ID well in advance of filling out the FAFSA. Highly recommend you're at this webinar, you're thinking of it. Before our second webinar, which is in November, we encourage you, we urge you to have your FSA ID completed by that point, right? Step 1 in getting to that December FAFSA, let's fill out our FSA ID. And if you've previously created an FSA ID, you do not need to create a new one. You must use the one that's already been established. So this is another reason why it's really good to start thinking about this now. If you already have an FSA ID and you don't remember the password or the email, there are ways to go about getting that information. You'll just need to go through the website, that FSA, the studentaid.gov website, to see about getting your account information that you don't remember, which again can take some time. So very important to start that now. And that brings us to the first part of stepping stones for FAFSA. I am going to look to Myrna and our university admissions if there was any common questions that you were asked in the Q&A that you would like to answer verbally. Or if anyone wants to answer,
Well,
not
there
answer,
was,
ask a
sorry.
question. Go ahead.
There was one question. It had to do more with the net price calculator and taking into consideration if the student is eligible for the lumberjack scholarship, would that be something that would reflect on the net price calculator? And yes, it would. So entering that GPA, the core GPA would generate that award under the merit area of the net price calculator. And that's the only question we've had so far. So
So we just have we're just gonna do a quick post survey, and then again, just really encouraging all of you to join us for our second session, which I believe is on November 13th. We will have that session where we're going to go over the different types of financial aid. We'll be going over some scholarships, how to fill out the FAFSA. We'll do that together. We'll go through a mock FAFSA, which is kind of fun. So you can see exactly what you're going to be seeing when that opens in December. And then, like I said at the very beginning, we will email out links. So don't feel like if you missed a link or you don't remember what I was showing, that you have to remember that we will be sending out links from the webinar tonight, as well as step-by-step instructions on how to do that FSA ID. And I would encourage all of you to make sure that you have your FSA ID all ready by the next time we meet. And I think that is it. Don't think I missed anything. If you do have any specific financial aid questions for NAU, you can email financial.aid@nau.edu. That will also be in the email tomorrow if you have specific questions. And you will be getting my email from the email tomorrow as well if you ever have specific questions that you would like to reach out about. All right. We hope all of you are committed to filling out your FSA ID and getting that all ready for our next webinar. And we look forward to seeing you on November 13th.